Richard E. Byrd, first to blaze an air route to the North Pole, prepares for a similar flight over the bottom of the Earth.
Some truths were sealed because the people who witnessed them were never supposed to survive long enough to speak.
Admiral Byrd heard there was an entrance to the center of the Earth through the South Pole.
One man did. For 70 years, he carried a secret that followed him through every night, every dream, and every attempt to live a normal life. He said his time was almost gone. Before he died, he wanted the world to know what Admiral Byrd had really found in Antarctica.
Admiral Byrd allegedly came upon something highly unexpected.
He said something had been waiting under the ice, and it had never gone away. The last survivor speaks. At 97 years old, Robert Johnson was the last surviving member of a classified Antarctic unit that served under Admiral Richard Byrd. No other man from that group remained alive to confirm what had happened. For most of his life, Johnson stayed hidden. He never wrote a memoir. He rejected interviews. He kept no personal archives. He avoided every military reunion. His silence was not a choice. It had been required. Shortly after returning from Antarctica, Johnson signed a document that he still remembered word for word. When Johnson signed that document after returning from Antarctica, he was signing under one of the most severe secrecy laws in American history. The Espionage Act of 1917, which was designed to punish anyone who revealed information that the U.S. government considered dangerous to national defense. The penalty was prison. The warning did not come from clerks or administrators. It came from senior intelligence officers assigned to Byrd's Antarctic Command. They met with him in a sealed room, still dressed in their naval uniforms, but carrying the authority of men who answered to agencies higher than the Navy. In private conversations, the officers used a different phrase. They warned him about consequences that would not appear in any courtroom. Johnson said the message had been clear. Someone would make sure he stayed quiet. For many years, he received unannounced visits from two men who wore the same dark coats every time. They arrived without identification. They never gave their names. They simply asked the same question again and again. Had he spoken to anyone about the mission? Johnson always said no. They always thanked him and left. He said the visits stopped in the late 1970s. By then, he had learned to censor his own thoughts. He spoke about the nightmares that stayed with him long after those visits ended. He remembered walking through frozen corridors where the ice echoed like metal. He remembered shapes carved into the walls that glowed with a faint light and a low hum that vibrated through the ground and into his bones. He still heard that same low hum at night, the deep, vibrating sound that had followed them through the ice. He said it felt like a signal calling from a distance, as if something was waiting for an answer. As he grew older, the fear changed. He was no longer afraid of the men who once threatened him. He was afraid of what remained under the ice. He believed the mission had never been about training or weather research. He believed that Admiral Byrd had been searching for something ancient, something buried, something that did not belong in any known chapter of human history. Johnson said the truth could fracture the foundation of modern faith. He said it could rewrite the story of human origins. He was certain it could shatter political power structures that had existed for generations. He spoke calmly as he said this. He had accepted that most people would not believe him, but he insisted that he was telling the truth. He was bent on not leaving this world with the secret. The path to this truth did not begin with Operation High Jump. It began with the man who led it, Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd. Admiral Byrd, hero or harbinger? Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd was revered as a national hero. Aviator, explorer, pioneer, he symbolized America's bravery and technical mastery. Headlines celebrated his flights. Cities named streets after him. Crowds cheered as he returned from the polar ice, maps in hand. In 1929, during his landmark Antarctic expedition, Byrd became the first man to fly over the South Pole, charting vast stretches of untouched terrain and gathering critical data on the continent's geography and climate. His mission aimed to map the uncharted polar regions, test long-range aviation in extreme conditions, and expand scientific understanding of the ice-covered continent. He succeeded, producing some of the earliest aerial photographs and maps of Antarctica and proving that sustained flight over the polar ice was possible. To the public, he was fearless and unshakable, the man who had conquered the edge of the world. But behind the fame, Byrd was consumed by something else. Crew members reported late-night sessions in his cabin where he scribbled endlessly, drawing shapes that made no sense. He filled pages with circuits, runes, and symbols that seemed to shift under the lamplight. Some said his hands shook as though he was trying to write messages from someone or something beyond understanding. Sleep became impossible for him. Conversations with Byrd grew tense and erratic. His demeanor suggested fear more than courage, a quiet obsession that unsettled everyone who worked under him. Early Antarctic missions revealed phenomena that no one could explain. During Byrd's earlier expeditions in the 1920s and 1930s, long before Operation High Jump, his teams conducted mapping flights, magnetic surveys, and geological studies across uncharted regions of the continent. They used early aircraft, dog-sled teams, and primitive radio equipment to push deeper into the ice than any explorers before them. It was on these early flights that Byrd first documented unusual magnetic readings, unexplained radio interference, and visual distortions on the horizon that did not match known geography. Mountain ranges appeared on the horizon as if rising from the ice, only to vanish hours later. Strange lights moved across the sky, pulsing with precise rhythm, almost like coded signals. Compass needles spun wildly, veering 40 degrees from established bearings. Byrd recorded these anomalies in secret logs and submitted reports directly to the Pentagon. His words were alarming. He wrote about constructs under the ice inconsistent with any known geological formation. The response was immediate. Classified protocols locked down all subsequent expeditions. Behind closed doors, he warned senior officers that the ice was not empty and that something was listening. Even his closest officers sensed the change. Byrd was no longer exploring. He was hunting, driven by an unseen force that seemed to radiate from the frozen continent. Johnson later recalled how Byrd's obsession pulled the men into a world that balanced on the edge of terror. His findings were no longer just maps or glaciers. They were warnings. The ice concealed something older than humanity, something that watched from beneath and waited. Byrd's duality was terrifying. The public knew only the hero, but Johnson witnessed the man haunted by knowledge, the man who had seen forces beneath Antarctica that were alive and aware. Every decision Byrd made from that point carried the weight of secrets that could shatter governments, belief systems, and the foundations of human understanding. And so Operation High Jump was assembled, not as a scientific journey, but as a military incursion into the unknown. High Jump, which the public believed was a scientific and training mission, was secretly planned as a military operation intended to investigate the discoveries Byrd had made. Operation High Jump. In 1946, the United States launched what the world would remember as Operation High Jump, the largest Antarctic expedition in history. Officially, it was a scientific mission, a training exercise to test personnel and equipment in extreme conditions. The personnel included pilots, navigators, engineers, radio operators, infantry units, and cold weather specialists. The equipment ranged from new aircraft models and radar systems to tracked vehicles, survival gear, and weapons modified for polar conditions. 14 ships, aircraft carriers, hundreds of planes, and nearly 5,000 troops made the journey south. On the surface, it looked like exploration and preparation. Underneath, it was something far darker. Johnson remembered the first time he saw the scale of the operation. Men moved like shadows among massive military vehicles. Tanks and anti-aircraft guns were positioned in sectors with no apparent threat. Entire stretches of ice were marked as no-fly zones for reasons that were never explained. The public was told stories of scientific research, but Johnson knew differently. They were preparing for war with something no one had ever seen. Strange incidents began almost immediately. Pilots returned from missions visibly shaken. Some spoke in stutters about things that moved faster than their aircraft, objects with metallic surfaces reflecting sunlight yet defying identification. Rescue teams were sent to retrieve personnel who had vanished, yet none of the disappearances were ever listed officially. Flight logs vanished or were rewritten. Entire areas of the map were erased. Even among the men, fear spread silently, like frost creeping over exposed skin. Johnson recalled overhearing hushed conversations about heat signatures detected under the ice and disc-shaped objects that appeared and disappeared without warning. Whispers spoke of beings and machines operating far beyond human comprehension, of intelligence that seemed aware of the explorers long before they arrived. Then came the casualties. Officially, there were none. Unofficially, men were injured, some disappeared, Others returned in a state of incomprehensible terror. No one spoke openly, yet the fear was palpable. Johnson said it was as if the ice itself had a memory, and it did not welcome intruders. The darkest element of high jump was the unacknowledged objective. Johnson later realized the mission was a test of military might against forces hidden beneath layers of ice for untold centuries. The equipment, the troops, the strategic planning, it all pointed to humanity stepping into a place that had never been meant for them. High jump was the first contact, if contact was the right word, with something that defied everything known. Something moved, observed, and perhaps even influenced events from beneath the ice. The expedition ended abruptly, after mysterious casualties and inexplicable phenomena that could not be publicly explained. Orders came down immediately for total secrecy. Any record, any witness testimony was suppressed. Johnson understood the truth even then. Humanity had brushed against a power far older and more advanced than itself, and the encounter had left marks on those who survived that could never be erased. But nothing compared to what Admiral Byrd experienced on his solo flight, a journey into a world beyond reason. The 3 hours he vanished became the darkest and most terrifying chapter of all. The 3 missing hours. In December 1946, Admiral Richard Byrd took off in his plane, cutting through the Antarctic sky in what was meant to be a routine reconnaissance mission. The weather was clear, instruments were stable, and the crew expected a brief flight. But then he vanished from all radio contact. For exactly 3 hours, Byrd's plane disappeared, as if swallowed by the frozen continent itself. Johnson, stationed in the radio room, remembered the static that replaced Byrd's voice. It was not normal interference. He described it as a metallic chorus, a vibration that crawled through the walls and into the bones of anyone listening. The hum that followed lingered like a presence, as if something unseen pressed its breath against the room. Johnson said it felt alive, and the memory of that sound haunted him for decades. According to Johnson, when Byrd finally returned, his face was pale, his hands trembled, and streaks of gray had appeared in his hair. He moved like a man who had walked through a place the human mind was never built to understand. Something had touched him, something no human had ever encountered before. Byrd's declassified diary later revealed what he had seen. He wrote of valleys warm enough to sustain rivers and vegetation, vast crystalline lakes that reflected impossible structures, and herds of colossal creatures with long tusks wandering a land that should not have existed. Above it all, enormous towers of shimmering crystal pulsed with light, as if responding to his presence. Byrd described a feeling of being watched, not by animals or men, but by an intelligence that studied him silently from within the glowing structures. According to his account, something waited in that hidden world, patient and aware. Byrd's duality was terrifying. The public knew only the hero, but Johnson witnessed the man haunted by knowledge, the man who had seen forces beneath Antarctica that were living and conscious. Every decision Byrd made from that point carried the weight of secrets that could have shattered governments' belief systems and the foundations of human understanding. And so Operation High Jump was assembled, not as a scientific journey, but as a military incursion into the unknown. An expedition armored for war. Johnson recalled that Byrd's aircraft had been flanked by disc-shaped craft, moving in perfect synchrony, guiding him gently through the alien landscape. The most disturbing part of Byrd's experience, Johnson revealed, had been the encounter with the being he called the Master. Humanoid yet ethereal, it radiated intelligence and power beyond comprehension. It spoke of humanity's destructive nature, of atomic weapons yet to be unleashed, and warned that the world's ambitions could trigger annihilation far beyond human imagining. Byrd emerged from the flight changed. He could not articulate fully what he had witnessed, and his reports to military intelligence were brief, fragmented, and heavily censored. Whispers among the crew and radio operators hinted that Byrd had seen the edge of something ancient and monumental. Johnson said that the Admiral's eyes carried the weight of knowledge meant to remain hidden. Every time he spoke to others, it was as if the air itself grew heavier. No one could look at him without feeling the pull of fear he had brought back from the ice. Even then, Johnson claimed he could still hear the echoes of Byrd's flight. The metallic chorus, the hum, the unearthly signals. They were reminders that what lay beneath Antarctica was not inert. It was alive, observing, and aware of those who dared enter. The 3 missing hours had been more than a disappearance. They had been humanity's first glimpse into a force that should have remained untouched. And then the unthinkable happened. It occurred in the second month of the mission, after Byrd's 3 missing hours, and after the first series of anomalous radio readings that had shaken the entire command structure. Johnson himself was ordered to enter the ice, stepping into the heart of a world that no human had ever survived intact. What he witnessed would eclipse even Byrd's terrifying flight. Into the forbidden fissure. Johnson had been awakened before dawn and told to pack for an off-record assignment. He was not briefed. No one was. A small group of 12 men had boarded a transport vehicle and moved across an area of the continent that appeared on no map. The silence inside the vehicle had felt unnatural. Even the engines seemed quiet, as if the entire landscape had been listening. When they arrived, the fissure had stood before them like an open wound in the earth. Its size had been overwhelming, but its shape had disturbed them even more. The edges were curved too perfectly, and the walls reflected light like a polished mineral. The air around it carried a strange pressure that had made breathing more difficult. The men had lowered themselves inside, and the temperature had shifted. It was colder than the surface, yet the walls looked wet and smooth. The ice behaved like something alive. When their lamps had passed over it, thin streaks of color had appeared and disappeared without explanation. Every footstep sent a vibration through their boots that had felt like a faint heartbeat rising from deep below. As they entered the tunnel, the hum had begun. It was not loud. It was steady and low, like the pulse of a machine buried far beneath them. The corridor seemed engineered with intention. The ceiling arched with mathematical precision, and the ground felt too level to be natural. Johnson had touched the wall once and pulled his hand away immediately. The surface was warm. The group had advanced until a sudden flash of blue light had swallowed the officer walking ahead. He did not yell. The sound around them did not change. He simply vanished. Panic spread across the team. Weapons were raised. Lamps swung wildly across the walls. No one knew where the officer had gone or what had taken him. Then they found a symbol engraved into the wall. It was not a letter. It was not an image. It had a shape that seemed to shift depending on where they stood. The symbol produced a faint vibration that ran up their arms. Johnson felt a pressure in his mind, like something was trying to understand him. Some men begged to retreat. Command refused. They insisted the team continue despite the rising dread. At that moment, Johnson realized they were no longer exploring. They were trespassing into a structure that did not belong to humanity. But what they found was never meant to be told, and the military made sure of that. Secrets they tried to bury. The moment Johnson returned to camp, armed officers had escorted him to a secure tent. He was separated from the other men and questioned for hours. The officers did not ask what he thought he saw. They asked exactly what he touched, where he walked, and how long he had stood near the symbol on the wall. Their questions revealed that they had already possessed classified knowledge of the structure. Later that night, Johnson witnessed activity across the base that had felt coordinated and rehearsed. Crates were loaded onto trucks. Documents were burned. Maps were replaced with new versions. Entire sections of the camp were sealed off behind temporary fencing. No one explained why. The following morning, Johnson learned that members of his team had been reassigned with no chance to speak to anyone. Some were placed under medical watch. Others were sent home under the claim of mental instability. Their names were removed from daily logs and replaced with false entries. Johnson's own journal had disappeared from his bunk. His camera was confiscated. Letters he had written to his family were returned to him with entire paragraphs removed. He understood immediately that the expedition had crossed a line that the public could never be allowed to see. Rumors began to spread quietly among the remaining crew. Some claimed the scientists had discovered a material not found anywhere else on Earth. Others whispered that the structure had reacted to heat and movement. A few believed the missing officer had not fallen. They believed he had been taken by something inside the tunnel. Johnson noticed the fear in their voices. It was not fear of the ice. It was fear of the people controlling the operation. He saw men escorted from their tents and never returned. He overheard intelligence officers discussing psychological evaluations and long-term containment strategies for anyone who had seen too much. By the end of the week, the mission had been rewritten entirely. The official report described nothing unusual. There was no reference to the fissure, no mention of the missing man, no hint of the artifact beneath the ice. Johnson realized they had not only buried the evidence, they had buried the truth of what humanity had encountered. With time running out in his life, Johnson had refused to let those secrets die with him. The devastating truth. Johnson had waited decades before he finally spoke. He had waited because he understood the danger. He had watched others disappear after questioning the official story. He had seen men he served beside lose their careers and reputations. Some had died under circumstances that were never explained. Silence had become a matter of survival. For 77 years, Robert Johnson had carried a weight that no man should ever bear. Now, at the edge of life, with death pressing close, he broke his silence. In the last years of his life, the fear had faded. The weight of the secret had not. He believed the world deserved to know what had truly happened during Byrd's expedition. He began his testimony by describing what he believed the government had feared most. They had not feared the structure. They had not feared the symbol. They had feared what the discovery meant. They had found evidence of a civilization older than human history, a civilization capable of building structures inside solid ice, a civilization that could bend material, energy, and space in ways modern science could not explain. This was not a legend. It was physical. It was real. Johnson admitted that the encounter inside the fissure had not been an accident. The structure had responded to them. The hum had increased when they approached the symbol. The air pressure had shifted when they raised their lamps. The disappearance of the officer had convinced Johnson that the structure possessed a form of intelligence. It had not been dormant, it had been waiting. He believed the government had feared that if the discovery became public, it would dismantle the foundations of every institution: religion, history, science, politics, power. Everything had relied on the belief that humanity understood its place in the world. Before he died, Johnson revealed his final fear. He still heard the hum when he closed his eyes. The sound had never left him. It told him that whatever lay beneath the ice had not remained silent after the expedition ended. Something was still active. Something was still aware, and after all those years, he believed it might no longer be alone. Johnson's final words were delivered with a gravity that could not be overstated. Every line, every pause carried the weight of years, of silence enforced, and of truths too dangerous to be spoken until then. He looked at the camera and said, "They told us we were in danger. But the real danger was never us. It was humanity. We were told they were a threat, but they were trying to warn us. The hum is still there, the machines are still running, and whatever sleeps beneath the ice is beginning to wake up. You are not ready for this. No one is." He ended his testimony with a single warning. Humanity had disturbed something ancient, and one day, the world would face the consequences of that mistake. Thank you for staying with us to the end. Kindly subscribe to the channel for more incredible videos.